Yeah. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the second episode of Adda series. So, the topic for today is the archive inside you, and we have with us Professor Irma McLaurin. So, let me introduce to you all Professor Irma. Irma McLaurin is the founder of the Irma McLaurin Black Feminist Archive, located in the Robert S. Cox Special Collections and University Archives Research Center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. It is dedicated to making black women visible and heard. Dr. Irma is also an activist, biocultural anthropologist, and award winning writer. As a Fulbright specialist, she taught Black feminist theory at Sri Varma College in Kerala, India, and she also appeared on AsiaNet News. So I welcome Dr. Irma, and I also request Dr. Sayan De to continue the conversation with her.
Okay, thank you so much, Arnav, for the brief and very important introduction of Professor McLaurin, and once again a warm welcome, Professor, to for sparing your time and joining with us. And I, at the personal level, has been very fascinated by your work on archives for the first time when I listened to you last year. And for me, the question that I would like to begin with is a sort of continuation with the conversations that we had at our center. And but I'm thinking of starting with a very basic question, because I know, at least in the Indian context, there are many individuals, young scholars, experienced scholars, who think that archiving is a very crucial way of documenting their research works. Um, but also, as one engages with the necessity of building cultural archives, at least in the Indian context, again, I can speak, is one is expected to engage with this particular aspect in a very intellectually elitist manner. And what I mean by the aspect of intellectually elitist manner is that being underpinned with intellectual recognitions, sociocultural affiliations, and funding support, which every time is not possible. Now, as an experienced archivist, what do you think? What are some of the factors that has elitized this particular practice of archiving across the world?
First, let me say thank you. It's good to see you again, Sade. And the last time we met was in Johannesburg. So it's good to meet you again in this space. Let me begin by saying I am not a trained archivist. I am a user of archives. I am a researcher. And I think in many ways it was my journey as a researcher that has shaped the motivation, that's motivated me and inspired me to create my own archive. You speak to the kind of elitist way in which archives have been historically developed, and I would agree with you. I think that indeed has been the case. And part of what I'm trying to do with my archive is to disrupt, that tradition, because historically it was trained archivists who made the determination of who was important enough or significant enough to be preserved. And so there's so many people out there whose materials we now come across and say, wow, this person did great things. At the moment they were doing it, they may not have been recognized. So part of what my archive is about is trying to preserve those who are not recognized now, because in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, we may look at their work again and it gives us an illumination that we could not have seen at that moment in time. And I'll give you a good example. The person that I have been researching through archives for the last 3 decades is Zora Neale Hurston. And Zora Neale Hurston, as people know, was kind of rediscovered in the mid-1980s by Alice Walker, who was taking a course on folklore and said, well, where are the Black folklorists? And so she began to do some research and discovered Zora Neale Hurston. Now everybody is familiar with Zora. Oprah made a movie out of her novel, Their Eyes Are Watching God, but she was mostly known as a creative writer, as a novelist. Well, Zora Neale Hurston was also trained as an anthropologist, and so I was in search of material that would give me some insight into her as an anthropologist. What were her methods? Did she have field notebooks? Where are they? And I couldn't find anything except In the Beinecke Library at Yale, there are letters between Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. And in those letters, she begins to describe her research methodology. She talks about what she's doing. And I began to get insight into her, how she processed and worked as an anthropologist. Fast forward, and a year ago, I was approached by Tracy Strain, who is a filmmaker, to say they were making a film on Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist, and that the work that I had been doing, researching and writing, was very significant because very few people had actually addressed her and looked at her and examined her critically as an anthropologist. Now there's a book out called, Ain't I an Anthropologist? I myself am working on another book called Lifting Zora Neale Hurston from the Shadows of Anthropology. And suddenly we have more information, but some of it was buried in archives. And I think it is that search, trying to identify and search out the materials that has made me sensitive to the fact, who gets to decide what is significant, what needs to be preserved? So one aspect of the Irma McLaurin Black Feminist Archive, which is housed at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and it's there because they also have the W.E.B. Du Bois papers. They have 99,000 items from W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, my archive is not going to touch that. He was a lot more prolific. But it gives you some understanding of the vast array of materials, notes, drafts of papers, talks, photographs. All of these things go into helping us understand who Du Bois was as an intellectual. I have sent 120 boxes to the university of my archives. Those are the ones that were in storage. They have digitized 397 of my black and white photos, but I have photos and slides from when I did my field work in Belize and some of my travels throughout the Caribbean. All of that material will be put together to tell the story of who I am as an intellectual, as a writer, as a poet, as a person. Family photos are in there as well. So those things will be preserved. And my archive is not just for me. I am constantly recruiting other people. So the identifying and the collection of material is one aspect. The second aspect of this archive, which we call the Black Feminist Archive for short, is that it is intended to disrupt and change the trajectory of the profession of archiving. We want to create a center where we actually train Black women and students who are interested in this work in the archive profession. Right now, according to the latest data, and this includes people who work in museums, less than 3% of all archivists are Black. Less than 3%. Less than 2% are Latino or Latinx, and less than 1% are Indigenous or Native American. So there has been a long way to go. And there has been a discussion in the archival field that I've been tracking about these silences, these absences, the way in which they have served as gatekeepers to keep non-white people out. Because in truth, archives were intended, and probably the first archives were those by Monticello, President, Thomas Jefferson. He turned over his materials and his library and his papers. And so probably the first, archive was really his. And he was good at documenting how many times that he reshaped the architectural form of Monticello. And so he kept notes and all of those things. So archives were initially intended to preserve the work, the materials of the wealthy, those people who had status, those people who were recognized as being significant. And it was not for, as John Dietz would say, of small things forgotten. It is not for the ordinary person. Our material was not considered worthy. And in fact, if I go back to Zora Neale Hurston, at the University of Florida, the materials they have on her that were donated are singed because they were burned. Zora Neale Hurston died penniless. And when she died in Fort Pierce at a poorhouse. And at that moment in time, what they did was to burn the materials, the belongings of poor people. They just burned them. While they were burning her stuff, a deputy sheriff, black, came along and he remembered that this black woman was used to be somebody, and he literally snatched her materials out of the fire. And he put them in storage in an old freezer he had on his porch. That's what black folks do. If it stops working, you use it as a storage item. And he kept them there and eventually took them to the University of Florida and gave it to them for free. So the materials that they had that he saved have singed edges because it tells us the story that we almost lost that material, that it was almost burned. So my goal in this is to let Black women know in particular, and I'm open to people who are trans, non-Black people can be in the archive. Anyone who understands the vision of this is to make Black women visible and heard. And the way that we do that is to let Black women know that the work that they do as artists, as activists, as scholars is important, even if it wasn't published, even if it wasn't recognized at the moment. It tells us a story about the totality of Black women's lives. And most recently, I received an email from someone who says, I read the article about your archive, and there's a friend of mine who's in a nursing home. She's about 80 something, 80, 88 years old, and she wasn't doing well. And she says, my friend who's Black has been collecting books on Black women, and she'd like to know, would you like them for your archive? I thought, wow. Now, probably the books are not, unless they're rare books, they're not that significant. The library may have them. But I said, we're very interested in why she chose to collect them at that moment in time. This is a woman who was born during segregation and so was among the first to get a degree. I think she got one of the first masters from Boston University in social work or something. And so I was very curious about why she had collected it. So we sent the reporter who had written the story to talk to her. It turns out she also was an artist. She had on her own trained herself to do art. So she did art with, I guess you would call it collages of fabric, but she also painted. So now we've got this person who on the one hand is a bibliophile. She's collecting the books. And now we discover she's an artist, right? And so this young woman goes to interview her. And at the end of the interview, May Upperman says, I had no idea that my material, that someone would think that my life was worthy of being preserved. That is the kind of story that we want to have continue to be collected and to be preserved in our archive.
And you are muted.
Yeah, sorry. This is such a fascinating perspective to begin with, Professor McLaurin, especially looking at the archive from a very anti-established lens, and where it's about hierarchizing the archive, not sort of bringing it down from the elitist stream, and it's sort of bringing to the common people about the common people to let the world know that knowledge production, knowledge values are not just the personal property of the elitist academic space or of two very specific certain races, certain gender communities, certain sexual groups, or certain various other privileged communities. But it is also every common people matters. Every knowledge of every common folk matters. And
Yes.
I think the whole historical process that you described in this perspective is absolutely so amazing. And now I would like to actually request Arnab to go ahead with the next question.
Yeah, actually, I have a question to ask. So, the way you told or described yourself as an untrained archivist, so I really like that because the term professional or trained brings back that Foucauldian notion of power and knowledge, that circularity. But having said that, my question is, how do you deal with the authentication crisis, or do you believe there is something called inauthentic knowledge that established academia always believes, and they always say that the knowledge needs to come from an authentic source? do you believe that, and how do you deal with that authentication crisis?
Well, one of the things that I used to teach when I was a faculty at the University of Florida was a course called The Anthropology of Tourism. And the whole crux of the anthropology of tourism lies on this idea of authenticity versus inauthenticity. Who decides? So one of the things that people who do the anthropology of tourism look at are all these studies that have been done about the performances that are done by, say, indigenous people, local people, that they perform for the tourists. The question then becomes, are they authentic or inauthentic? And I think what people have discovered, particularly those who are from inside the culture who have also become anthropologists, is that people create. Culture is not static. So whatever they do is authentic for that moment. But there are two forms of cultural production. One is what they call front stage. There is a performance that is done for the sake of the tourists, but there's also backstage, which is the meaning and the discussions that they're having behind the performance they decide to give. So I think this question of authenticity, inauthenticity, whether something is real or not real, these are questions that serve to set up the binary of power and control. Who gets to decide what's authentic? Who gets to decide what's real? Who gets to decide what's true? All of us, culture is an ongoing iterative process. As it is created, it breaks down one thing and creates something new. Some things persist throughout. And who is to say that that's not authentic or inauthentic? You know, who is to say that this conversation we're having on this platform, right? This digital platform, which could not have been imagined 50 years ago, right, is inauthentic or authentic. So I think for me, I don't worry about the categories. I've never been one to worry about categories. I've had some people say, well, I'm not sure I want to be in a feminist archive, even if it's a Black feminist. I'm not a feminist. I don't subscribe to that. And my thing is that I've used that term. I've chosen to appropriate that term for my own use. I don't ask people who are in the archive to subscribe to it, because at the core of what I'm doing is the preservation of Black women's lives. However they define that, whatever category or classification they use is okay. And I think the power of my archive is that we have a memorandum of understanding with the library, because it occurred to me at some moment in time, the person who was the director when I started passed away at the end of 2021. And I thought, well, what if something happens to me? How will I know that the idea, the vision is going to be carried forth? Because I had to go through and start explaining to the new person who took over what the archive was about, what our intent was. And so we created a memorandum of understanding that preserves the vision and mission of the archive as an intact process. That whether I'm physically there, whether the current director is there, whether they get a new dean of the library, whether the chancellor of the library changes, there is an agreement about what the agenda is about. And there are two things. One, it is the preservation of Black women's material lives in whatever form that takes to make them visible and heard. And two is that those who contribute have agency. They get to have the discussion with the archivist about how they want their material presented. That is highly unusual, because often when you turn over materials to an archive, they take it over, they start writing up the material, and you sort of become a passive. It's like you've given a gift and now it's out of your hands. That is not the way that we're doing it. We are actively involving the contributor if they're able. Sometimes they're not. But we want them to have a say in the description that goes forth on them. So I am very involved in this process of creating the Black Feminist Archive. I have meetings with the director and the staff. We talk about branding. We talk about how to present. We talk about sort of how they're going to process. Are there questions that the person who's working on the descriptions have that I can answer rather than them inferring and assuming? So there is a level of agency in my archive that I think makes it very unique, not only for myself and my material, but for everyone who's going to be in it, if they so choose.
Yes, Professor, if I can take this conversation a little bit forward, for example, take a certain group of people starts misrepresenting whatever it may be, and they start creating their own forms of archives. So let's say after 200 years, the next generation, when they will look back, they have your perspective, they have the other perspective. How will they know that which one to subscribe and which not? Will it not create confusion?
No, because they're all true. In other words, there is no uniformity in terms of what culture is. There is no one person who has, the sacred text of what a culture is supposed to be. There are what we call it the Rashomon effect. There are always multiple perspectives. Rashomon was a Japanese movie made in like the 1930s about a samurai who's killed. And you have multiple perspectives. You have the ghost of the samurai, you have his wife, you have the swordsman who supposedly killed him, you have someone who is sort of on the side, and all of those things are perspectives on, what happened. Now, so what it is that you're really asking about truth with a capital T. Who decides the capital T? And what I'm saying is that there is no capital T. There will always be small t's because everybody comes at it differently, whether it is their gender that dictates that, whether it is their sexual orientation, whether it is their religion, whether it is their language and the way in which they enter that cultural space. Do they know the language? Do they not know the language? Are they native, speakers, or did they learn the language? There are nuances. But the way that they see that culture is a truth to them. So to me, they can all coexist. And then it is up to the researcher who is interested in telling the story about what they've discovered to let us know that there are these multiple perspectives, on it. So, for example, Zora Neale Hurston is great. She has been presented up until this time as primarily a literary person. And yet we know she was trained as an anthropologist. Well, the reason for that is that most of the people who've been studying her were literary scholars. And so that was always their lens. They would acknowledge that she was an anthropologist, but they knew nothing about the history of the discipline or the methodology. What I bring to the table in terms of my perspective on Zora is that I'm actually trained as a creative writer. I've been writing poetry since I was 8. I have an MFA in English, so I also have a certification, that I'm a legitimate poet. I've published materials in over 16 magazines and anthologies, so I'm a published poet. My work has been translated into Swedish and Spanish, so it has a global perspective. So I understand Zora's impulse as a writer. But I also have a PhD in anthropology. I was trained in the method, the history. I don't always like the history, but at least I understand it and I have access to it. And now I can look at the products that she produced and say, what makes Zora interesting is that her literary material was clearly informed by her anthropology, her ethnographic research. That is, her plays, she took the material that she was collecting as an ethnographer, and she used that to form the basis of her plays. And then at the same time, she used some of the knowledge of her stylistic approach as a writer to write anthropology, her ethnographies, in ways that were very different at that time. There was a certain structure for how you presented ethnographic data in a very omniscient narrator's voice, third person. Zora was very much involved. You knew she was in the text, and that was highly unusual at that time. In the 1980s, they called it writing culture, that there was a new style of writing. Anthropology and ethnography. They were beginning to look at ethnography as a genre, as a literary genre. My position is Zora had been there and done that back in the 1930s. So she had already, in some ways, anticipated the kind of trend of looking at ethnography not just as the summation of one's research, but as a literary style, as a genre. And so I think that all of those things are possible. We can hold, as I think, someone once said, how do you hold two opposing ideas at the same time? And I think that's what you're asking is, how do we know which version is true? I think the person who is asking the question will look at all of the perspectives and make that decision themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful explanation. And also thank you for mentioning that movie Rashomon. It's a wonderful movie. So if I can ask
Yeah.
you, what actually led you to think about this Black feminist archive? Are there some specific experiences which may be personal or collective? Can you please share those with us?
Yes, I think in some ways it was. I was talking to a friend at Spelman College, and she was telling me they were getting ready for commencement, and the archivist there had come to the event, and then she went home and literally dropped dead. And I said to myself, what if I dropped dead tomorrow? What would happen to all the stuff that is in my office? And by that time, I was, I'm not sure if I was retired, but I had a home office. It had papers, boxes. I have poems that I wrote that were finished, unfinished, essays that I started and, were going to publish, but never got around to it, or materials that I submitted for publication that at that moment in time were not accepted. It didn't mean they weren't good. It meant that the perspective I was offering at that moment in time, as we know, was not necessarily a welcome perspective for those who were the gatekeepers of, traditional journals. So I think it was that idea, what if I died tomorrow? What would happen to my stuff? So I have a video on YouTube now for people who are thinking of archiving called, What Are You Going to Do With Your Stuff? And I go through and show them their piles of paper and their books. And I said, if my family came, they would, not out of disrespect, but they would say, let's just clean this stuff up, because they don't know the value of that stuff. It's not their world. And so it's those of us who understand the value of this stuff that we should be proactive in making sure that it gets organized and collected and ultimately preserved.
Okay, thank you. And now I request Sayanda to carry forward the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arno, for asking this really very interesting questions, and thank you, Professor McLaurin, for sharing these perspectives. To continue with the conversation further and more about your Black feminist archives, and some of the things that we have already started speaking, but would like to hear more from you, is as far as I know, that you started this, and as you already shared, that as this whole archival project as a personal archive, and then it gradually expanded to be a collective archive. And then, if I correctly also remember, when we had a conversation in Joburg, you were also talking about applying for institutional fundings to ensure the long-term, in fact, the lifetime existence of this whole archive. So what are some of the different challenges that you basically encountered while shaping this archive and while shaping this whole project? If you can share with us that.
I think there are two things that struck me most. And I can't say that there's a kind of neat order or chronology to this. Yes, it began with me wanting to make sure that my life's work was protected in some ways, that it didn't get discarded. And I'd applied for a job at City College at one point as director of Afro-American Studies. And as I was speaking with someone on the committee, she was telling me the story that Harlem was undergoing a lot of changes. And, people who had not been part of its history, who were not Black, were now moving in. And she talked about walking as she walked to work, finding boxes of papers, of materials that were the records of some Black organization that had been discarded on the street. And so I think it's those ideas that people who come in who don't know the history, who don't know the person, who don't know the culture, might come in and take a look at that and say, oh, that's not important. That's just stuff we need to throw away. Once it's gone, it's gone. You can never go back and reproduce it. So I think always in the back of my head is that people don't know the value of what I've done. So it's my responsibility to make sure that gets preserved. And so I started with that. But then also my friends. I have many friends who are activists. Activists are noted for doing great action, but they don't archive their materials. They give these speeches, but they don't necessarily write them down. And if they do, they don't necessarily type them up. So I also wanted to make sure that activists who are doing the work, that their material gets preserved. We know about the activists who are famous. We know about the Angela Davises, right? But what about the people who were raising money for her? Who were holding protests and who were writing letters in support of her? Where is their stuff? Because they're as important. So I'm actually not necessarily interested in collecting marquee people. That is, people that are noted by the media as being famous or significant. I'm actually really interested in the ordinary people who are on the ground doing the work to make sure that their stuff gets preserved. So I would say that's one aspect. The other is institutional support. So when I began this, I recognized that if I thought it was important enough, it was my responsibility to demonstrate that. I've raised $40,000. It took $25,000 for the archive to be endowed. I've raised $40,000 completely on my own without the university help. They created the brochure, they sent out the fundraising letter, but the actual work was done by me. And every year I donate at least $1,000, more if I can. It's tax deductible. And so I've also done things such as my nephew who passed away at a very early age of 35. I asked the family, would it be okay if people made a contribution to the archive in his name? So people have been able to give gifts in the name of people. What about if they wanted to give a gift in the name of their mother? So their mother's name would be preserved. So for my birthday on Facebook, all of these things, I had a 70th birthday party and I asked people, rather than send me a gift, just make a donation to the archive. Now the institution is at a moment because they've also had some leadership changes. We now have a woman dean who actually is a Southeast Asian woman, and she has committed herself to saying this is important under her leadership. And so we're in the process of writing larger grants to basically create a center where we can bring Black archivists and give them time to build their career while working on the materials in the archive. We hope to have some student fellows, graduate student fellows, who would also assist in raising the visibility of the archive. And I can tell you, when the contributors find out that they can be involved, they're very aggressive about, well, what are you finding? And I want this, and have you thought about that? And so there's this kind of dialogue and energy that's going on. I am grateful to the Winter-Grin Foundation because they provided me with what's called a Historical Archive Grant, an HAG. And one of the other contributors, Sheila Walker, who's a filmmaker, she's donated over 5,000 slides and hundreds of hours of documentary footage about the Afro-Latino presence in the African presence in Latin America. So she also received a grant. It was $15,000, and with that grant, I was able to pay for the shipping of 120 boxes, which was about $4,000. And the rest of the material money was spent for me to go back to Gainesville, because I now lived in North Carolina, to have some people come with me and to begin to organize and sort and label the boxes before they were shipped. So Winter-Grin has been a great supporter. But here's the thing about that grant. I'd never heard of it. It was a white colleague who said, well, Irma, if you're doing this archive, do you know about this grant? I believe that white anthropologists knew about it, generally men, and I think they've been giving this grant for years. I don't know if there was ever a person of color who received that grant up until I got one, because it's not well known. And what I thought, and I remember seeing the materials of one of my colleagues, the late Marvin Harris, who is like a noted figure in anthropology. I was at the Smithsonian when his papers came. And I think his son was there and someone else. And I thought, no one in my family would necessarily have the knowledge or skills to know what to do with my paper. And the Smithsonian had said to me, oh, if you ever want your papers, you can have them here. And I thought, I needed, at that moment in time, I don't think I thought about an archive formally, but I didn't necessarily want to be in that space, So I think in the back of my head, I've always been someone interested in cultural preservation, because in those 120 boxes, I found papers and documents from high school that had been preserved. It turns out my mother was someone who saw the possibilities, because the poetry books that I wrote at 8 years old, she kept. I had them. So I have 2 books of poetry, tattered just covers, that my mother preserved, that I started when I was 8 years old, and I'm now 71. So those kinds of things tell me that she had some foresight that this was important and it should be preserved. And I think that, as given the title of this, that there's an archive inside of us, not only the sort of collection of memories that we carry, but the material culture. And I would encourage everyone to go back and ask your parents, do you have the certificates or the documents from when you did things in grade school? Photographs. These are the materials of archives, and it's not too early to begin to keep those things in such a way that they're preserved, and then decide what to do with them.
I think this is just so motivating and powerful, because it just reminds me, while you were speaking, especially about how this whole process of archiving and also having research fellows, having archivists in residence, if I can put it in that way, and how you brought up these different documents right from the scratches.
Yes.
Which is society just think it as a discard. And it just reminds me of the whole Fanonian argument as well, that the black body of knowledge, or the black existence of knowledge, which has also been written quite a lot by Lewis Gordon as well, Professor Lewis Gordon as well, and various other scholars across the US and other parts of the world, that the black body of knowledge has always been historically treated as an whole element of discard, of no value.
Yes.
And how your work is such a strong and powerful, not just a sort of gender resistance, a racial resistance, but altogether a very well constructed decolonial resistance against this whole historical process.
Absolutely. And I would say that in the tradition of decolonization, one is that we have to retrain our brain and our mental state, as Fanon knew, to recognize that we have been conditioned to believe that what we do has no value. And let me say, even in the academy, right now at this moment, since George Floyd's death and the protest and the Black Lives Matter, now archivists, white archivists are scrambling to their black faculty and saying, give me your material, right? We think you're now important. I say to those people, do you want to be, as my mother said, a fly in the buttermilk? Or do you want to send your material to the Black Feminist Archive, where we are creating an archival home, where there is going to be a constellation, a kind of synergy, a powerful element of people, a collection, a community, a communitas, of people who share your experiences, who or some variation of it in the diaspora, who understand sort of why you need to have these things preserved, because I know that there are stacks and stacks of materials. I have the rejection letters from publishers of a biography I was working on, where they basically said she wasn't important enough as a Black person. They were looking for a marquee person, and she wasn't significant enough. That material is going to be preserved in my archive. How we are treated in the academy, that material is going to be preserved in the archive. So it's very important that we understand where we give our material to. And even if people don't want to come into my archives, some people believe that it should be local. Well, in this age of digitization, it doesn't matter where the physical material is. What matters is that it gets digitized. So it can be anywhere, it can live anywhere. But the important thing is there's a lot of material that are given to libraries that never gets digitized because there's no money. There is a commitment by the University of Massachusetts to make this archive available and activated as soon as possible. And so we are raising funds and writing grants. And as I said, I make donations. I've left a bequest in my estate so that there will be money going to it even after I'm gone. But to give you an indication, when I gave one of my first talks about this archive to the Lutie Lytle Conference, this is a conference of Black women law scholars from all across the country, 125 Black women who teach in the law profession, who run law clinics, who write for law journals. After I gave that talk, I said, how many of you think that your work should be archived? One person raised their hand out of 124 people, one person. And that person was a woman who was a dean. She was one of 2 Black women deans in the entire country. And the archivist had come to her because she recognized that this was significant. Well, the person who invited me to that, Angela Onawachi, was a student while I was teaching at Grinnell. She is now the first Black woman dean at Boston University Law School. But in giving that talk, I had them recognize that what I call they're laboring in the academic fields, the papers they produce, the classes, their course syllabi, their notes, their lectures, all these things were important and that they needed to start thinking about archiving it. And that is also my mission. If I don't get the materials to at least raise awareness that what you do is important. And in this moment of erasure, where we have laws that are saying what can and cannot be taught in schools, where books are being banned, it is critical that we have a location someplace that we will then teach our children to go to the library and read the primary material. If you can't get it in the schools, then at least have it someplace where they can have access. And what I love about the University of Massachusetts, you have the Du Bois Center there. They already have a model where they're working with school teachers. They have a weekly conversation where they read Du Bois's materials. They have fellows through a Mellon grant that come in and do research in the archive. That's the model that I want to replicate in terms of the Black Feminist Archive. So it is possible, you know.
So, yeah, Sanda, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes. So actually, because Professor, you have been talking about in terms of building the archives and the necessity of digitizing the different documents to make it available. We also have a very particular question for you with respect to that. So may I, if I just invite Arnob to share the question?
Yes, but can I ask Professor Irma another question? I have a question in mind. Yeah. So, Professor, you said that you were kind of disturbed by the sudden death of your friend. You had multiple thoughts, your unfinished projects, and all. So, my question is a bit philosophical in nature. How do you see the process of archivation? Do you see it as a perpetually and ontologically incomplete and unfinished project, or do you see it by its own right a complete thing at every moment from the very moment of its birth? And if it is the earlier one, if you see that as an incomplete process, then are you haunted by it, or do you celebrate that incompleteness? What's your thought on that?
One of the things I learned when I was studying for my Master's of Fine Arts and writing poetry and going through workshops is that I could keep writing the same poem over and over again. I could edit it, I could get more feedback, and I would work on that one poem for the rest of my life. It is a process. Writing is a process. Archiving is a process. Living our lives is a process. So for me, it's processual. It's not an either or binary. And I think being trained as an anthropologist and having taken a course years ago with an archaeologist called Martin Wopes, we really had a whole course in which we tried to say, is it possible to do something without classifications, without typologies? So I tend not to subscribe to typologies or binary thinking that it's either this or that. I like to think of things as processual. And I think that the more material we have in the archive, and as we're putting it together and figuring out how to make it available and accessible to people, that we will change the direction and the trajectory of what archiving means, that it will itself grow and develop in a different kind of way. I cannot project 50 years from now what is going to be the technology that's made available. Who knows? People might be able to step into a virtual version of Black Feminist Archive and feel like with 3D glasses that they're actually in there looking at the actual material. I know that those things are possible now, and they will get even more sophisticated. What I'm interested in is gathering as much material as possible, not only from the United States, but all over the world. There are Black women in Vienna. Didn't know that until I met them at a conference. So I'm interested, at some point, we want to create a summit where we have voices. I came across an exhibit called Excavating Black Women's Lives in Germany. You know, I want to gather as much of that material, and even if it's not physically located in my archive, that we become a resource, a portal through which people can find information. So I'm going to ask you two, what are you going to do with these tapes? You know, where are they going to be physically housed? Because we don't know the lifespan of this platform, whether it's Google, whether it's YouTube. I don't know how many people remember MySpace, but remember MySpace was the big thing. It doesn't exist anymore. If it does, it's on a very small scale. So I'm telling people, put the actual physical materials into my archive, and then whatever platform they need to be made available on, they can do that. So it's trying to take advantage of the accessibility of things now today, but it's also recognizing is that we have no control over this technology. And so that's why libraries still want the hard copies of stuff, because they recognize how tenuous and how do you say it? Not only tenuous, but in some ways, you know, technology is almost like going on a date where someone's kind of playing with you. You just don't know what's going to happen, right? And in 5 years, this whole platform of Google could be gone, Zoom could be gone, and it's something totally different. And if your material is not compatible, you lose it. You know, and I've done that. I have an archival website because all the hyperlinks that I put in it to articles that were published no longer available, because every time that place changed its platform, the links disappeared. So I've had to start thinking about how to make that not happen. So rather than put a link to something, I now put the whole article in so that people can see where the original was. But if that disappears, they still have access. That's the kind of forward thinking we have to do in the archive. I want to be, and I started this because I wanted to be as much a part of this while my mind was still able to sort of be sharp. I didn't want to be sitting on a stage and people talking about what I had done and I have no clue of where I am. So I'm very actively involved in this because I know there will come a moment in time when I won't be. But by then it will be exactly as I want it to be. And that's not only thinking about the here and now, but it's also anticipating, you know, what might happen, say, in the future. And I see one of my graduate students, Dr. Sybil Rosado, has joined us. She's in South Carolina. And Dr. Sybil has been working on Black hair. And she actually went to India and studied where the extensions and the materials are made. And so I've been encouraging her to make sure that she archives, you know, her notes and all that material because it's so important, you know.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. McLaurin, and yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sybil, for joining us, and nice to have you here with us. This is a sort of conversation which is going to be never ending, but
yes,
we both just don't want to sort of take over this whole space. So I would like to encourage other, you know, attendees who are here that please feel free to unmute yourself raise a question, put your question in the chat box. What do you feel like? It doesn't have to be a question necessarily. It can be just a few set of comments, but please feel free to share.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
Shrima,
you
you
are.
are.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So basically, you are talking about in one point that lack of funding, and because of the lack of funding, sometimes some of the documents that are not getting the space to be digitalized. So my question is that this lack of funding is not, it is also politically very much controlled, that which kind of, I mean, materials will be get digitalized and which will be not. That is also very much politically controlled, because maybe it is also sometimes they try to control that some of the documents not to be very much popular in that way. So is it not that case? I mean, if you talk something about that.
Well, actually, I have. I mean, the beauty of what we're doing is that we're small. We're just starting. And the library has made a commitment. If you go, we now have our own space in Sunday. I don't know if you can find it, but there's a space. If you go to Black Feminist Archive, SCUA, you'll find the link there. We now have our own page on the library's platform. And what you will see are the people listed are those people who have already been digitized. So as things come in, they're making every effort to digitize. I actually have given donated money to say this money is specifically to help digitize my collection. So people, when they contribute, if they have the means, they could make a gift to say, I want to use this to make sure that you can start digitizing my collection. They're making as much available as possible. And in the meantime, we're writing grants. There are many foundations that have been very supportive of making sure that material of people who historically have been excluded are now, available. But I would say if you go, I know scholars who went to some of the larger libraries and things, and they had materials that were sent to them by people who were not so famous. And they say, I couldn't get to them because they weren't digitized yet. They're sitting in boxes. So part of my agenda when I started this was to make sure that we began to raise the resources and we have the funding that as we invite people in, that we're able to get their materials digitized as soon as possible. The historical archive grant I received was not for digitization, but it did allow me to go through, describe, begin to prepare it so that the digitization can take place. The library does have funds, not a lot, but they do have funds to digitize. So as material comes in small batches, they're actually able to do that, right? So I think for this archive, there's a concerted effort to make sure that materials don't just sit around, that as it comes forward to us, we try and get at least as much of it as possible accessible. So that's the commitment. And because we're starting small, we can do that. I think if we got like hundreds of thousands of things, then it would be a problem. But right now we're small enough. And I'm encouraging people, if you believe this is a good mission, then it's a tax deductible donation to ask people to join us. We cannot ask, particularly if it's a white institution, which I think I have a right to. I have 2 degrees from them. I worked for them. I paid taxes in the States. So I feel I should have access. And they have the means. They've proven their commitment to archives, preserving archives of social change. That is their niche, that they are a small archive, but it is an archive of social change, of which the bulk of it is the W.B. Du Bois papers. And they just got the Daniel Ellsberg's papers. So this is an archive that is going to be there for a long time, just given who's in it. They have an archive on disability that they've collected. They have papers of the East Coast Black Panthers. So I feel like my material is going to be in good company. And I know that they are committed to making sure that the material is accessible to teachers and to scholars. So I think we're on the same page in that sense, and I'm not facing any kind of resistance. But the profession of archiving still has a long ways to go. It is trying to make some amends, but if you think about it, less than 4%. And when I meet Black archivists at other places, I won't name an institution where I met someone where I was giving a talk, and she came to the talk and she was very frustrated. She was talking about leaving because she felt that there was no mobility for her, and there weren't materials that she really wanted to work on. So I'm hoping that the Black Feminist Archive will be like a magnet, that it will attract not only scholars, but people in the profession. And it may encourage someone who's a scholar to say, gee, I think I'd like to actually be in this profession. So I think it has dual purposes in that sense. But thank you, Shrima, for that question.
Thank you so much, ma'am. If you allow me, then basically I have another question also. May I?
Yes.
Okay, actually, in the very beginning of your lecture, you are talking about some of the silent voices in your in the archives, right? So, suppose some of the voices that in the archive that are silent, and in some point of time when they are traced and they are they are taken or discovered, then what happened that seems to be that they are contradicting the dominant discourses that was earlier, right? So in that point of time, does the dominant discourse some way try to try to resilent them so that the dominant discourse cannot be some way dismantled?
When you're a researcher and you're going into an archive and you're discovering voices that have been marginalized, there is always a vehicle to get the information out about them. I mean, I don't think that archives are controlled in that way because they're just repositories. It's what the researcher does with that. So, for example, I have made it a point of writing about Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist, even though the dominant discourse has been presenting her as a literary person. So both are possible and both are able to be written about and talked about in that sense. I don't think that there's a kind of gatekeeping that is going to be able to control that kind of knowledge. I think that it's very possible that information will get out there, but the point is to have it available so people even know that there are marginal voices or unheard voices that need to be made available. And I hope that we will become known again for making unheard voices visible and heard. That's our mission statement, if you will.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Is there any other questions? Yeah. Is there any other question? If you have, you can unmute yourself and speak to Professor McLeod.
And also, while people think about the questions, I just wanted to very briefly add that how this, also with all the conversations that have been taking place, that archive is a profession, archive is an emotion, archive is a way of existence. I would also like to add the necessity of adopting archive as a method of research, as a method of existence. How necessary is to acknowledge that value of archives as a method.
Well, I mean, we all do it informally. Just go back to the picture albums that we collect, the documents that families save. I mean, so in a sense, all of us not only carry an archive inside of us, but to some extent, all of us have been archivists. We save those pictures that our kids did in kindergarten. We save the materials of we have the diplomas that we received. We don't throw those away. We save them because they stand as symbols, testimonies of a moment in time and of an accomplishment. So I think to an extent, all of us to some extent, recipes that were given to us, that were handed down, these are archives. They may, what form they take really depends, but all of us to some extent are archivists on a daily basis. It's part of our everyday life. So in that respect, it is a methodology. It is a process that we engage in. And I think we all do it. We're just not conscious. We don't use that nomenclature, that terminology, but we're doing it, you know. And so the next time you go out, I have a friend who every time she goes to an event, she keeps a ledger book and she keeps the tickets from that event and she makes notations. Well, those books are archives. They tell us a story about the various events and journeys that have made up her lives. And all of us do that in some ways. You go to people's houses and you see on the walls certain kinds of materials that say, oh, this is when we were married, or this is when we got together, or this is when this event occurred, or this is, you know, I'm here at Grinnell College for a commencement. And so, you know, the photographs that will be taken, the programs, all of those things will be saved so that 50 years from now, there is going to be an archive of this moment in time. And I want to thank you both, Sanye and Arnab, for the title, because I'm actually weaving that into my remarks. And people can watch it live stream, Grinnell College live stream tomorrow at 10 a.m. Central Time. The commencement, I have 3 minutes, and so I will have my 3 minutes. And this talk and thinking about it has actually inspired those comments. So thank you.
No, thank you so much, Professor McLaurin. I don't know if we have any question, because it's also almost, we are on the verge of wrapping up as well. So probably if there is no question, but I would also like to thank all of you, all the colleagues who have found out some time joining from different parts of the world. It's a great feeling to see you here. And thank you so much, my co-host Arnav, for being there, for holding to the space, and for all the conversations. And once again, thank you, Professor McLaurin, for finding out time. It's not an idle day to engage in conversations, probably, but at least you find a time on a Sunday morning to be with us, and for sharing such amazing and powerful insights about the question of archive. And I'm very sure we have so much to take away from this whole set of conversations. Very soon we are going to put it up as a part of the archival exercise about the archive on our respective YouTube channel, and so that we can share it widely with different people who also couldn't join us. Yes. But thank you so much once again, Professor McLaurin, and thanks all of you for being there. It really feels happy and great. Thanks once again.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you, and have a nice day, evening, and morning wherever you are. Please take care and stay well.
Thanks everybody for joining.
Take care. Bye.